Hey guys, I had a little intro that I thought of yesterday that I wanted to lead here with. If you haven't checked out the schedule yet, what we're doing is two of these new storm style lessons. It'll be today and 2 days from now. These are guys that won this lesson through the Instagram giveaway that I did for 2 weeks, approaching the night vision launch. So I think it's how I'm going to continue to take guests, is give stuff out over Instagram. WM2K, aka Connor, is our guest today. Just let me know that you guys can hear me in the chat, and I'll get into this. I mentioned on Run It Once, I'm going to start doing a lot more videos come March. I think March, April, May, I'm going to try to put out a total of 9 videos, so 3 a month. I've had some pretty big advancements in terms of where I think I'm going with my training models, just in general. Overall, working with a lot of different guys continues to be the best way to refine what I'm doing, like in the overarching picture, in terms of the detail I'm able to go into, being able to cater to wider demographic, and being able to understand different paradigms in a way where I can go very deep into micro aspects and then scale back into macro aspects. And that continues to be the most important thing, is how do I take something like a 5,000 hand storm that you're going to see here, where I literally go through every single hand that the guy played in 5,000, and I create a theme around the most relevant points that scales into a 1 hour or 75-minute lesson. I'm just going to go into this lead right now because I think it's a good time before I lose my organization of it. Okay, so one of the reasons that coaching takes too long, in my opinion, when a new student comes in, it can be one of two things. Either the coach is sucking in terms of the content he's providing, or the student is not properly integrating the material that we're covering, and so we end up having a pattern where we're always going back. I've had students call it the whack-a-mole effect, where you nail one thing down, 2 other nails pop up, and you're never able to actually advance because the student is having trouble integrating the concepts. That's the student's problem, in a sense, because it's a commitment thing and it's an intensity thing in terms of training away from the lesson to be able to integrate the concepts that we go over in a way that he can consistently apply them. I made a Run It Once post yesterday on consistency, and I think it's the single biggest thing that probably separates a substantially winning player at any limit from a player who's more marginally winning, maybe even losing, or just prone to more severe regressions. How much can you hold it together in game, more or less? How much can you consistently do the thing that you know is correct without having mental game traps get in the way and kind of hijack your analysis? So I got to a point where I saw this with enough students that there were students that were better at the integration process and also had better work ethic, but there were also students with very good work ethic that just didn't know how to integrate well. So from a coaching standpoint, that led me into a higher level of responsibility where I kind of decided that I had to take on a more mature position with beginning to create more of a training model or routine that guided the student through the process of integration. So that's where we're at now. The 5,000 hand storm kind of scaled from the 30-second exercise. I told you guys I was doing just way more innovative hands-on work with students, trying to get them more active in lesson. This is something that's a very good complement to the 30-second exercise because you can still use 30-second exercise within this, but for the most part, it's scaling toward a very macro level of integration that puts the burden on the student to do what I basically tell him is going to work in terms of an integrational process. The CFP guys, there's 10 of them right now, the 2 preliminary ones that I started the course with and then the other 8. I sort of handed this off to them in terms of, I said, look guys, here's my idea. I know if we can optimize the integration process of these storms, that you guys can get way better much faster. So help me understand what's working for you after we do a storm together, because they're doing this format with some pretty good success actually. I said, after we do a storm, tell me what is helping you integrate the content so that I can create sort of a universal map for where we're going with this. And so what I do more or less more than anything these days is I listen to what the students say works for them, and then I try to create more of a universal macro approach to recommendations for how you should go about integrating a lesson like this. The beauty of integration, and I'll do a run it once video on this in the future, is that it allows you to sort of play above the clouds of analysis. We call it cruising altitude in my little circle, where you finally clear the clouds and there's no more turbulence because you're out of the zone of being prone to over-analytical distortion, meaning you're no longer in the ranging zone as often. You're no longer making assessments that you're not challenging the credibility of, and then making even more biased decisions based on those initial assessments. So this is the heart of subconscious integration. You guys have, if you've been with me from the start and run it once, you always hear me use my favorite example of the grandmaster mentality as opposed to the expert mentality. You sit a grandmaster down in an endgame position on a chessboard, and you sit an expert player down with that same position. The grandmaster is understanding much more while consciously processing much less than the expert player. So my goal is to get to the point where my guys are subconsciously integrated on all of the major concepts that they need to be, in a way that allows them to play from a level of very clean, present awareness, I guess you would call it, where they're not so prone to be in over-analytical modes where they basically fuck their trajectory up in terms of their decision-making process and go way off track. That's what consistency is. It's when you have distilled the lesson format to such a level of integration, to such a subtlety, that there is no more room for conscious thought to hijack the decision-making process. I think that's a good explanation of it. Props to Tim, who brought us some pure Slovenian coffee to Las Vegas, and I'm enjoying it quite a bit. Tim's friend. All right, cool. Take a question before I get in. I have some mental problem with the game. Every time I start winning at poker, I feel some fear and I want to stop while I'm good, because I feel that I can run bad and lose or go on a downswing and feel bad. Yeah, I've seen that in students. It's just a maturity thing in terms of clarifying what you're here for. Perspective is always the gateway to higher balance with this type of thing, especially emotional balance. One of the main things I went into in the PDMG pack that I felt like was important was like giving the student a much clearer overall direction for his purpose as a player. Because if you have that, you're not playing in such a micro format, which is prone again to over-analytical distortion. In this case, mental game distortion of bankroll management. If you don't know that you're already going to play 50 to 75,000 hands that month and 500 to 700,000 hands that year, you're so much more likely to play, to just fly by the seat, to fly by session by session. Like, that's not a good place to be in, where you're living or dying by each session. And that's sort of what you're feeling. If you saw my video on Run It Once recently, which was called A Truthful Conversation, the player in that video suffered from not making decisions at the table that he knew were plus EVs, similar to this one, where he had booked a win, and then he was about to sit out, and last orbit, he would get dealt like a really good hand that was supposed to be played as a pre-flop all-in, but he would find the fold under the same premise that you're justifying, which is like, oh, I can't gamble here even though I know it's plus EV because it's too disturbing to me to potentially book a loss. I'll just book my win. You can't be in that mode. I mean, looking at it logically, it's really clear to see how that's sabotaging you. It's just negative EV, and those decisions are going to pile up and screw you over in the end. Okay, so in the spirit of the 5,000 hand storm, what I usually do is I go through the batch. If there's enough leaks, I won't do very small pots. Here I did sort of a mix, right down to like 8 BBs or so. But basically what I'm trying to do is pick out three major concepts that I can create sort of a lesson map out of. In this one, we're going to be looking at concepts like forced aggression, polarization issues, and assumptive ranging / bluff catching issues, which I'll bring more context to when it comes up. Usually I end up titling these storms with like 3 concepts, where then the student has the big 3 that he can create a map out of, and go in and try to focus the integration on those three. Now, this is something that we're working a lot more on because I really think, and where all my focus is right now is how do we optimize the integration process of these big three concepts? Well, first, the student has to be presented with analysis where he understands what happened in the hand that went wrong. Here we have 30 hands. I'll be doing it in each one. From there, he leaves the lesson with basically an assignment to go back, rewatch it, and group the hands within the three categories that they fit in. So now he has all of his forced aggression hands, all of his polarization issue hands, and all of his poor bluff catches. From there, he can start to create context around each of the themes. After he has hands grouped in each of the categories that he's creating context out of, he can eventually end up with what I'm calling an essential truth for that theme. It's basically the most distilled, potent sentence that you can come up with. Could be a couple different sentences, but something that you can hold on to and integrate where you're not even really required to consciously think about it, but if you needed something in game, you could go to that sentence in that scenario where you had a bluff catch on the line and be like, this is my essential truth. It guides me to accurate decision making because it's, for the most part, very rock solid in its notion and very sustainable. In other words, there's not many exceptions to this rule. That's what a distilled truth or an essential truth is. So it's reliable, more or less, as a last line of defense. If the integration needs something to latch onto, it's there for that. So my whole thing right now is that I really believe that if I can optimize the integrational process through the storm and send the student off with basically a process that he can create a mind map out of that then he can integrate over the next week or so and come back with a new 5,000 hands 1 week later. So say we do a 5,000 hand storm once every 2 weeks for the first 10 weeks of his training model. So yeah, that's 5 storms. I really believe that if 5 storms get optimized and the student takes full responsibility for integrating all of the little golden nuggets from each and every storm, that you can bring a student up one limit every 2 lessons. Now that doesn't mean that he's going to move up until he puts in the volume, but his technical capacity and his mental game integration will be of a 100 NL player 2 storms later. So that's basically 2.5 hours of coaching, and then however much study it takes him to integrate it can do the trick. So this is what I'm so interested in because it's completely blowing out the model of what we believe to be the norm in terms of how long it takes to progress as a player. I firmly believe that the reason that we don't have more progression from micro to high stakes is because there is a lack of skill in the coaching industry. I think there's enough guys out there who are ambitious enough that if they had the correct content and also had the advice on the mental side of how to integrate it, that they could make advancements much faster. So I'll close with that before I get into the hands, is that my whole focus right now is how to optimize the training model so we have the most efficient model possible that gets the student the fastest results possible with the most integration so that we're not skipping steps. We're just literally focused on the most relevant things for win rate gain at any stage in the development, and we're stacking it in a way that's most efficient for integration. So it's all about speed. In a way, it's selfish of me because you have to understand if I can pull this off at that type of level of acceleration, I can open up the CFP program and make it more lucrative than anyone ever imagined, especially if I'm doing stuff like resourcing content, which I'll talk about in the last 2 streams of this month. The new CFP program is opening up in March 1st, and the way that it will work is I will start off doing a storm with each of the students, and then based on that, I'll go into my archive from these old guys I have. We have beta testers right now who are organizing all of the videos I've already done for storms, and they're basically coming up with an organizational system for that archive. So after I do a storm with you, if you're my new CFP student, I will specifically tailor a lesson plan for you by hand picking certain archived lessons that are basically exactly what you're dealing with at your stage in the development. So now I have a way to do 1 hour of work with a student, drop off 3 or 4 hours of videos that are specifically catering to his leaks, and then meet up with him after he's integrated that, and we'll do another storm, and we just stack from there. So highly efficient, highly time conserving for me, and overall just like a really awesome way to use a lot of different guys who are ambitious and willing to share material to accelerate everybody's growth. And by share material, I just mean like realize if you join my CFP program, your lessons will be resourced to the other students in the program, and vice versa. You'll get their lessons. Okay, what's up, D-Dog? Welcome. Saw Server in the chat too. What's up, bro? Let's see. Somebody asked a question about the PDNV launch. It was good. We have about 55 members in the Skype group right now off the launch, and it's a nice little group so far. I'm really looking forward to scaling with it. It's nice to have a new Skype group that's like totally active and fresh. It's something I want to really keep doing, like for as long as I run Poker Detox, is like continue to parlay the guys that are still active and ambitious and working on something, like working actively, into a Skype group where they can remain connected, especially when it's something as relevant as, mapping. Like night vision is like a very specific niche right now. Johnny asked, is there any way to get these videos from private coachings? Yeah, get accepted to the CFP program. Eventually, I haven't thought this out yet, but I thought, okay, if we can create really solid paths out of some of these concepts, because the beauty of Storm, actually, I didn't mention this, the beauty of Storm actually is that there only are like 5 or 6 overarching concepts that really come up that prevent a student from moving from like micros to MSNL. And then from MSNL to high stakes, it's mostly mental game and consistency. So discovering that, which I only discovered through working with a bunch of different guys, was super inspiring and exciting, because for me, if there's only 5 pillars I have to cover, that's a very simplified training model for me to organize. So from there, it's about taking the 5 pillars and then getting enough sub lessons within each of those categories that I feel like that section or that realm of the game, that zone, is really filled out and balanced in a lot of different directions. What does Nick look at for in a potential CFP student? One sec, guys. I'm just going to open my door. Okay, so I'm going to tell this story that I told the other day to my CFP group. You have to understand, I took on 8 losers for the first trial. That was something I wanted to do because, wow, that's a really annoying noise. One sec. The reason I took on losers is because I was in the mode where I said, okay, I want to make a statement to the poker community that this is actually being done from the right energy, and I really want to reward guys who never had a fucking chance in hell if something like this didn't come out. These are guys that can't pay for coaching. These are guys that other CFP programs won't take because nobody wants a loser, or at least they have a way smaller chance of getting involved in other CFP programs. And on another note, it was a personal challenge where I said, wow, if I could do this, what conviction it would give me to scale the program from there if I could turn, all 8 of these guys into winners. The beauty of it that I didn't foresee when I started it is that a lot of the archived lessons are starting from a very foundational place. So it's allowing me to build the program and the archived lessons from a really concrete foundation and scale from there, which I think is like the coolest, most efficient way to build an archived folder or a training program. So again, I can't stress enough how this has been constantly revealed to me as I've scaled in the last year with opening Poker Detox and just coaching more in general, getting involved more with the community. So much of my progression is stimulated by working with people and seeing what works and allowing them to teach me. That's such the constant interesting part of it to me is that all I really do more than anything now is listen. I might speak a lot when I speak, but for the most part, when I arrive to a phone call with a student or a group meeting or something like that, I focus on always speaking last for the most part. I'll give my lecture or whatever and give direction for the conversation, and then I listen. And by listening more, I actually gain way more understanding of where we need to go to accelerate the learning process. And then that scales to the macro of how do I How do I organize the creativity of the business overall? How do I set up the CFP program and map it well? All this type of stuff that is super interesting to me, and I will make some real videos that go very deep into this. You saw that flow state video I did with Kevin Lawrence on the Twitch if you've been following me back since November. This is going to be much more of like how to understand how all of the advancements in terms of leveraging creativity and actual production of content comes from going very deep into the micro and then coming back into the macro in terms of integration. So you can look at in terms of a storm, where it's like we go very deep into the micro aspect of the storm, only to come back to essential truths that become integrated that the student doesn't have to think about consciously. Take it to a business level, and I'm going very deep into the micro level of working with many students, only come back to the macro level of distilling a universal map for how the organization of the content is going to be able to provide a lot of efficiency for a wide demographic if I do open it up to a larger scale. So many patterns that really start to just present themselves when you make yourself available to different levels. Okay, I'm tired of talking, at least about that, so let's do hands. This coffee's so strong. We got an aggro guy. His hand's fine so far. So it's a triple barrel off of a 3-bet. Bet. At first glance, if you posted this hand in a forum, you would probably get applause, and the justification would need to be nothing more than, looks like a great barrel in theory, card hits your range and you don't have many bluffs, so you need to bluff this hand. I want to open you guys up to understanding the difference between range versus range thinking and hand versus range thinking. Range versus range thinking is a product of being in a very theory-oriented position. Range versus range teaches you to assess the strength of your range versus the strength of the opponent's range, and then to decide what the general level of aggression is that you want to apply, and it will manifest in thoughts like, I'm at the bottom of my range, this is the only bluff I have left. That's a simplified version of what's going on here. I'm not so sure that this is what Connor was thinking, but I know if this gets posted in a forum, or I know if I'm talking to a student, a lot of the justification for barreling off here has nothing to do with the strength of out of positions range. It has much more to do with his interest in making sure that he can balance enough bluffs in the spot. So that's range versus range. It's you trying to play your range in a way that makes sense from a theoretical orientation. Hand versus range is much more focused on, will the opponent fold enough if I bluff in this spot, in simplest format. So here, if we take our eyes off of being balanced for a second, let's look at the composition of out of positions range. We barreled an overcard, so he probably doesn't have 9s and 8s anymore at very high of a frequency. He's probably not floating too much ace-jack from the flop. He might have some backdoor flush draw, but that's only 2 combinations because the jack is a diamond on the river. So really what his range looks like here is like a significant amount of top pair, a substantial amount of 2-pair, some sets, and some straights, because he can have ace-king and he can probably have 8-9 suited at some frequency. And that's what Connor's saying. He's like, what was going through my mind was ace-king got there. That's more in my range than his, so let's do this. That's range versus range. Realize how it has blinders on to the actual strength of villain's range, which the way that I just outlined, which I don't think is very assumptive, is very prone to just be on hero call or undisciplined call, I guess I would call it. You guys have to understand, when you're creating blueprint strategies, a blueprint strategy in terms of strategy development can go back as far in the macro as saying, it's not part of my overall strategy to be bluffing a pool that's undisciplined, especially in spots where their range that they're looking down at consists of a substantial amount of strong top pair plus, a lot of 2-pair, some sets, some straights. Generally just not the type of range I'm trying to bluff, even when I can rep a really strong range myself. The reason being, and I tell guys this, and they have this like aha moment where I'm like, I'll say this in the chat, or when I'm in a lesson with a student, I see them bluff a fish, and I just pull back to the macro for 1 second, and I'm like, do you think that it's part of an overall winning strategy to make money from bluffing fish? It's a very basic question, but it really checkmates the mind because like it's very hard to answer yes to that question. The reason that you sit down at a table is because fish spew off. Now, don't get me wrong, there are profiles of fish who call to fold away money on the river, but overall, for the most part, if we were just going to categorize from a very generic blueprint position, we are not here to try to bluff fish. The pool in general is undisciplined in nature, just as an alias. So in vacuum conditions, I'm really not interested in bluffing unless I have hotspot recognition over mass database samples, which do exist, but they exist in certain zones. That's why night vision is cool, because it teaches you where the hotspots are. What I'm not interested in is barreling in a spot where the villain has a higher than normal distribution of like strong top pair, 2-pair plus, and that's what we have going on here. So I don't think I would have a bluffing range in a vacuum in this spot because I just don't trust enough guys to fold the types of hands that if you looked on a PO Solver manual strategy grid, he would have to fold to make 8-6 indifferent or plus EV to bluffing. So this hand to me goes under forced aggression. Here's a 3-bet with kings, squeeze actually. C-bet flop is fine. Check back is also okay. Here's the part where we are getting into very dangerous territory with polarization issues. In order to jam here, we would have to think that out of position's range was pretty wide pre-flop. Like, think about how hard this turn crushes his range now. And now think about whether or not kings is actually enjoying getting called. And now think about whether, as a player in position with one street left to act, jamming for protection is incentivized with how much we're crushed when we get called on average. The other thing that you would need to justify this is maybe if you had a read that villain was a fish. Now you sort of have that pre-flop read that he's wider than average, and you also have what I sort of call a volatility read post-flop. It's a term that I'll probably describe later on, but it's like a new jargon that I use within the training circle, where if you have a volatility read, it basically means that the player can be expected to do something unorthodox and loose and spewy post-flop. So that's what I would need here. I would need some sort of player read that this guy gets it in really light to be barreling off here with this quality hand on this texture in this formation where middle position called a 3-bet squeeze from cutoff after flattening UTG. So one thing to sort of draw to the last hand in the spirit of the storm, which is all about creating pattern recognition and grouping hands, I talked about how last hand I'm looking at hand versus range. I'm still doing that here. Make no mistake, but I'm also simultaneously aware that his range might actually be stronger than mine on this card. It might just crush his range that hard. So when I'm thinking about potentially value betting this hand, or however I'm classifying it, like a merge between value betting and betting for protection, I guess you would call it, if you actually understood how far behind you're going to be when you get called by a good player here, where you're coming to is the clarity that the hand doesn't have enough equity when called to be betting for protection, more or less. So that is a function of understanding the strength of his range. So you're always using ranging dynamics, and you always are looking at the assessment of the strength of your opponent's range, but I'm just doing it more in terms of versus my exact hand. And most people are doing it in terms of like, well, should I bet more frequently on this card or check more frequently? And then they make their decision based on that. It's less accurate because it's less offensive of a strategic model. Like, realize that when you're making your decisions based on what you should be doing with your overall range, you have blinders on to exploitative options of defense imbalances in the pool. Like, this guy's probably not folding enough with what his range, if he's playing a well-defined pre-flop range, you probably shouldn't even be semi-bluffing the turn with ace-queen. In other words, what I'm saying is his calling frequency in the turn might be so high here because his range is so strong, especially if he doesn't play a turn donk range, which he likely should do on this card at some frequency, just to weaken his checking range enough to give you incentive to still bet some of these hands. If he's not doing that and he's checking range, you probably should be doing a ton of checking back because he's at the range advantage. I'm satisfied with that so far. Andy says, fish fast play their range on early streets too much and show up to the river with too many weak hands. That can be true. It also has a degree of assumption embedded in it, and it doesn't acknowledge what's going on with the texture here, which is that this is a very specific turn that's really interacting very, very well with out of positions range. So that's the part that I would add to that analysis to just make it a little bit more well balanced. Nutter Gutter asked, what do we do if villain bets pot on the river after turn checks back, I'm assuming? Well, that's a spot where, because the turn interacted so well with his range, I really find it hard to believe that he has a natural polarity if he reopens the river. Like, it's very hard to create different possible strategy compositions for him in terms of a betting range that we'd be comfortable calling against. This is like more mental game stuff. I talk about this in the PDMG pack, like confidence interval work. Basically, we don't want to like assign a finite range to him when he reopens river because that's far too assumptive. But if we created, say, 3 mock ranges for him and said, okay, if he shows up to the river with these 3 ranges, how likely is it that each of these ranges could create a range that polarizes with a bet that could be bluffing frequently enough to make kings a call? I think you're hard pressed to find that as a tendency in the pool, that the average guy who reopened with the range he's looking down at on even a brick here would be incentivizing kings to call. He'd have to just be turning a lot of shit into bluffs, like pairs, or he'd have to be floating significantly wider than we would expect him to on this texture to have unpaired stuff left. And I don't even know what that would be, because unless he's floating like a substantial amount of ace queen, he's going to be looking down at a river spot where he needs to be bluffing pairs in order to be bluffing enough here. So that's a polarization spot where turn is just a check back. Here's a 3-bet. Flop c-bet's perfectly fine. Check call turn is good. We end up check calling river here. Generally, this is not a spot where I feel like I need to give resistance in a vacuum, because the pool is not, and this isn't just a vacuum, this is a full stack opponent. It's something I want you guys to add to your context. In terms of trying to establish a fish read or a volatility read, which is the type of thing I'm looking for before I bluff catch more aggressively in these spots, realize that the full stacks are much more prone to be the regulars. And the regulars have a much lower level of volatility. I'm not saying that you can't encounter an aggressive reg who bluffs too much here. I'm just saying, on average, if we grouped all the fish over here and all the regs over here, you'd be better off bluff catching versus the fish alias on average, and by a long shot. So the first thing I have is, this isn't actually a vacuum. Because I know how to subcategorize the alias, I'm up against a full stack opponent who's on average more of a reg, and probably playing substantially tighter frequencies than a fish alias. On top of that, like from a theory perspective, your hand really doesn't have great blocker qualities. You're blocking backdoor flush draws and some queen jack off and jack 9 suited. So that's not good. Really, you're making quite an exploitative call here if you call with this exact hand, assuming that you'd call with similar hands in your range consistently. So in a vacuum, if this is part of your default strategy, I would say it's rooted in a pretty high level of assumption, because you're not using a well randomized check call to begin with in terms of you have poor blockers. And on top of that, I don't think that you have the environmental reads from a full stack player to justify check calling on a turn card where, like, okay, you have to understand this card actually is significantly better for your range more often than not, depending on how you organize the flop ranges and pre-flop ranges. On average, this card's better for out of position. You've checked it, and now you've check called it, representing something from what you have up to king queen and maybe some slow plays. Generally, I don't think this is a spot that gets overbluffed, and there's nothing I have behind that except for meta to justify that. So here's where I will apply a certain level of intuition and be like, I just don't think this is a spot that gets overbluffed when you've check called and represented, a substantial like composition or range composition of like 10x plus, and the river's a total brick, and there's a lot of misdraw on board. To me, I just think it gets checked back pretty frequently, but I'm going on meta there, so I can't back that up with any quantifiable data. That's just something that I would do for me if I was trying to go above the rim and make the call, make the decision myself, on a level of trust, basically. In other words, it's like there's this very unquantifiable aspect of being a good hand reader and decision maker, especially on the river, where it's like, does he expect me to fold here? And just pulling back to that like third person awareness almost, and being like, all right, based on what my range probably looks like, if he's a relatively normal thinking player, like the average player in a poker community at this limit, would he really believe that I'm playing a range that is dying to overfold in this spot? I don't necessarily think so. Like, I wouldn't classify this as a spot where like you're so capped, because even a lot of hands in your range that we would classify as capped are still relatively easy to hero call, like queens and jacks. Even the 10, like ace 10 can like easily hero call here. Johnny's asking, what's the weakest hand you would call here? Good question, because if I'm saying that I don't think villain is bluffing enough here in this exact spot, then from a hand versus range perspective, I only want to be calling with hands that dominate a portion of his value. So I think I could start to justify calling with like King Jack if I thought that he could float flop with some weak King X backdoor flush draw. King Queen is for sure a call. I think you could start calling it King Jack. Someone's asking, why don't we like the King of Diamonds to continue on the turn when it gives us additional equity and may still fold out better? I think it's a polarization issue there too. You might fold out slightly better, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the bet becomes better than the check. I think your hand has a substantial amount of equity in terms of just showdown, and polarizing with it, I don't know if it's as functional as checking. My gut is telling me it's not. In other words, I think it's assumptive of you to think that we fold out enough better stuff on average to make this a better bet than a check. I was telling a student last night, and this is really cool. How did I explain it? Okay, I said, I want you to try to get on board with the fact that all I'm ever doing is accessing sort of a radar in the background of my thought process that you guys know, like the sound bars on a microphone where they go up when you speak louder and then when you speak softer they go down. That's what my radar is doing, but my radar is tuned to assumption. So anytime I have a conscious thought, I've trained myself to put my awareness on the assumptive radar, the sound bar, and if it gets past a certain treble or threshold, my sirens go off and I say, take a closer look at the credibility of the last thought you had, and before you spin off into the next assumption that's built on that one, challenge the credibility of that root thought. This is what I see in terms of ruining the consistency of a lot of players, is they don't have that transparency to that radar detector, and they follow the trail of their own thoughts too much, to the point where 3 thoughts down the road their trajectory is completely fucked because it's predicated on an initial bias assumption that was never challenged for its credibility. I explained it yesterday in terms of windshield wipers, but I like this example better, that soundbar where once it crosses a certain threshold you have sirens going off. Because all that I care about is proving what I actually don't have enough confidence in. It's a really different way of approaching hand reading and decision making in general that I think is always going to drive you towards a more balanced, accurate decision. Because instead of trying to accumulate data points to present a tangible argument in one direction, I'm accumulating data points by actually assessing what I do not have confidence in. If your only purpose is to demonstrate the data points that you lack enough confidence in touching or grasping onto to base your decision on, you're left with everything that you have confidence in. So my process is more of a negative approach. As opposed to grasping for things to justify my decision, I'm looking from a negative place of distillation. It's very counterintuitive, but what's left after you distill beyond assumption is truth or balanced observation. Are my observations still biased to an extent? Yes, but they're less biased than most people's, I would say. The coffee is actually not filtered, which is interesting. Somehow, Slovenians have found a way to boil coffee without filters, and the residue seeps to the bottom, but it doesn't interfere with the cup, which is also counterintuitive. I like it though. It's very bold blend. Too assumptive. I'm gonna have to go faster, guys. As much as I love talking about these in depth, I want to get the patterns across. Let's take a look at this again. 3-bet gets called. Guy bets turn. Guy bets river. On a runout that I would classify as code red. Um, he's also betting really large, which is a subtle data point that I would attribute some credit to, especially when a lot of his range could consist of a boat. I cannot assign enough confidence that he has enough air in his range, or that he's value betting worse to justify calling here with how high of a distribution of his call 3-bet preflop range could connect really hard with this board. So I would find the fold and justify it on the run out being just code red enough that by the time he polarizes river, I can no longer say that I dominate value, which I still could say on the turn. Like he could have bet a queen on the turn. Now on the river, it's too assumptive to say he has a queen. So see how I'm distilling again? And I'm saying, what don't I have confidence in? I don't have enough confidence that I can put him on a queen. Therefore, I'm not going to say that I have reason to call based on domination. And I don't have enough confidence to find enough hands that he could be bluffing. He can have like ace-jack. That's about it. And I don't know if that's enough combinations unless he bluffs it very aggressively to be good. He'd have to be taking strategies where like he's flatting suited ace-x clubs pre-flop, bluffing it aggressively, or turning naked stuff like suited ace-x pre-flop into a bluff, or turning pocket pairs into a bluff over multiple streets, all of which I think are highly assumptive and low-frequency confidence interval profiles. So yeah, that's just it. My confidence is not there. We called there, and I think it's a fold. 3-bet. Turn barrel. This is the type of spot where it's interesting because the 4 is definitely better for your range than his on average. If we threw this in a solver, I really wonder what we would find in terms of range asymmetry and EVs, because I know the 4 is better for you. I know in general the flush is better for him. It changes sometimes depending on what type of 3-bet range you're using. Obviously, out of position will do better if he uses more suited hands. In position will also do better if he floats more suited hands pre-flop. So it's hard to say exactly without range clairvoyance pre-flop who interacts better in the flush zone, but we can say with pretty high confidence that out of position has more 4x than in position in this spot, so that helps the out of position player. What I don't like from a range versus range perspective is that the type of hands that he's floating on average in a spot where I know the pool has a tendency to overfold versus the c-bet on the flop, and I know that from mass database hotspots, lends me to believe that since his floating range is more equity driven than a solver's, he interacts better than we think with this card. And betting to give up river is probably not the answer, because I think a lot of his range just improved enough to float again. He's going to call you with any ace. He's going to peel you a ton with Broadway club or pair plus club. And he's clearly not going anywhere with a better hand than that. So we end up in a spot where it's a little ambitious to barrel turn with a gutter, in my opinion. And then I'm so in the wilderness in terms of like whether or not I can say with a high enough confidence that this player folds enough to 3 barrels that I'm just not ready to invest further with aggression in the hand on the turn. So see, I did it again there where it's just like I don't have enough confidence in the work that I've done. Like maybe if I did hours and hours more of PO work and then categorize the alias with texture tendencies in this line over 30, 50 million hand samples. If I got enough data, I could refine my analysis and justify it further, but I don't have it, therefore I'm not going to assume it, therefore I'm not going to place my confidence in an investment in that direction, and I'm just going to instead choose the 0 EV decision and check out on the turn. Another thing I mentioned this lesson last night is like, you've got to understand that like you're the one that has to live with all your bluffs at the end of the day. At some point in like 2016, very early on, no, I think like end of 2015, when I really started to take off as an independent learner, I just like had to sit down with myself one night and I was like, dude, you're the one who you're answering to at the end of the day with all of your aggression, and you're not good with it. Like I wasn't content with the bulk of the spots that I was forcing aggression in large pots. And I was just like, well, what is the reason that you're doing it? Like, what is the credibility that you're assigning that this is even correct in the first place? You can't justify it with any quantifiable data points. That alone should be a signal to you that it's coming from some sort of compulsive place that you're not thoroughly investigating. And once I saw that, I still couldn't prove that it was right or wrong. And I couldn't really prove where that compulsion was coming from. I felt on an intuitive level that it was coming from an imbalanced place where I was trying to prove something or trying to get to the end goal quicker than just being disciplined. I felt that much, but I really had no proof that these bluffs weren't plus EV. All I had was a good indicator that my results weren't where I wanted them to be, and these were spots where I wasn't comfortable with my game at the end of the day. So I made a direction to experiment the other way, the more disciplined way, and things got a lot better really quick. So it's part of my training model that like a lot of it is predicated on self-trust and exploration. Like if you've been in this for enough time, you're the type of guy I want because you've probably proven yourself to not have the results you want by doing it your way for long enough. So then you have a choice. I can't provide you enough data to show you that all these river bluffs are negative EV on this exact run out in this exact formation. We don't have the macro data to do that, but I can tell you that these are the adjustments I made, and these are the things that winning players are not doing as consistently as you, so they're clearly not necessary, and you clearly can't quantify them or justify them with real data points or well-balanced observations. So why are you so stuck on them? And you have a choice to leap off into the unknown direction, almost based on just trust or faith, if you want to call it that. Like the faith that your win rate could be higher and something is not right about your current strategy. So what is the most relevant or intelligent thing to investigate and explore changing? One of the biggest problems with forcing the turn aggression is that if you're not very disciplined and you have a forced aggression leak to begin with, you end up blasting the river more frequently than you should in spots where, again, you can't justify the river bluff. So it becomes a compounded error. So a lot of what I advocate in terms of reserved play or disciplined play that starts from the turn or even from the flop in some examples is designed to prevent a player from actually compounding a leak in another direction and blasting off a stack because he's stuck in that aggressive momentum that he just can't get out of. See that so much. Or like if the guy had just sat on his hands, literally, and not bluffed the turn, he wouldn't have even been in the river spot where he would have been prone to the mental leak that forced aggression in the first place. What's this guy doing? Oh, he checked back river. Okay. Here we're calling a 4-bet with ace-8 suited versus the effective middle position. Even if this guy's a volatile player, this isn't really the way that I'm designing making my money. I would need I don't even know if I would, I don't know if I would 3-bet this hand if I had the read that I would need to have to justify calling a 4-bet. I think I'd probably just flat it. In other words, you do not want to, even if this guy's a fish, you don't want to set yourself up to be in a low SPR spot versus a volatile player where you can't realize enough of your equity with a reverse dominated hand to begin with in a low SPR pot. Like this hand does well with deep SPR where you can reverse dominate, where you can dominate flushes in his range and get a lot of money in when you do. or when you can keep his range slightly wider so your hand is not as reverse dominated when you flop one pair hands. So it's just the wrong, from a blueprint strategy development perspective, it's just the wrong idea to have, even if this guy is a fish, as to how we want to play against him. Another way of thinking about it is you just don't have enough playability and position at this stack depth to try to make a hand this far down in your call 4-bet range plus EV. Sure, there's ranges that we could design for him on the 4-bet that this could be good against, but realize the level of assumption in assigning him those ranges, where ace-8 suited pushes enough equity pre-flop to have enough realization value post-flop versus range. In general, this is a spot that's just really tight on the 4-bet in pretty much all pools, and I guarantee you if he's 4-betting a range of like 2 to 2.5%, which is probably even like generous, you're fucked because he's using enough multi-street aggression, or he's check calling enough when he does press the check button post-flop that you have no hotspots available to you to exploitatively bluff, at least none that are relevant enough to incentivize you to get into that position by investing 20 BBs pre-flop, or calling the 4-bet, I guess, more relevantly. So it's one of the things that guys don't have a good enough grasp on, because like if you talk to a general community player, what he'll say here most likely is a pot odds thing. Like, and even that, like this guy's 4-betting big. We're only getting 2.4 to 1 here. But even if we were getting 3 to 1, I'm still folding. And guys getting 3 to 1 would be like, well, you're getting 3 to 1, like it makes it much more of a call. A lot of that argument is predicated on the fact that he's balancing a bluffing range at the right frequency to begin with, or that he's playing good frequencies post-flop that are letting you get to showdown enough. A lot of these volatile players will just blast off. You won't get the realization value, and they'll still be betting merged enough to prevent you from doing anything crafty in terms of playability. So this is a spot where like a lot of guys would call me a nit, but I'm very honest. I think at least I'm not very assumptive about saying that I'm so good in position with a suited ace at low SPR that I can make this work for me. At the end of the day, like you have to be just honest about how much playability your hand actually has versus the range you're up against. And I think those are the things that aren't taken into consideration. Is like some guys might only look at pot odds. Some guys might just be pissed off and want to go to war. Some guys might over exaggerate how much playability and win rate they have because the player is a fish, where they don't take into account that with this quality hand at this stacked pot ratio, where the fish is still 4-betting from UTG, like you better have a fucking read that he likes to 4-bet really wide. That's the other thing. Like, just because he's a fish doesn't mean it's part of his strategy to 4-bet bluff wide. You better have a data point that supports that you've seen a showdown or you have a high 4-bet frequency for him in general, before you go around doing something like this, because I see guys over applying fish reads too. Like, it's not a general fish tendency to 4-bet super wide MP versus cutoff. That's not why they're necessarily fish. In other words, if you were to take the Bayesian confidence of how often a fish player also showed up on average to be a really aggro 4-better, I don't think there'd be a super strong correlation, not enough for you to just go splashing around with this type of hand. I've made a resolution to start pronouncing Bayesian the right way, and I still don't know if I'm doing it properly, but I know that enough people are not saying it the way I was previously, which is Bayesian, so I'm willing to change. Trying to be less assumptive. Now the problem is that this is probably a call in theory, but his range is already so strong on the flop that our hand just doesn't have enough playability. And by playability, I mean a combination of exploitative opportunities on future streets and also just raw realization or implied value. This is what I mean. You're just going to get blasted off really frequently. I know I'm being results oriented, but like I'm being honest too that like this is what happens. You improved your equity distribution, you still can't get the realization. You improve the equity of your hand, you still can't get the realization out of it. And like what happens on a spade if he jams? Like I don't even think you can call there, because the other problem is if he's bluffing with ace king or ace queen, he's playing perfectly versus your hand. Even ace jack, which is a spastic bluff from a fish, but a value bet versus you because you're playing ace 8 suited preflop. This is a polarization issue. You could group this hand with the pocket king's hand. We're 3-betting the UTG, and we're betting turn in a spot where our hand would kind of enjoy realization. It would really enjoy not getting check raised off of it by like, nut flush draws and better hands. And at the end of the day, I don't think we get enough value off the turn bet to justify opening up the betting in a spot that's so volatile. So this goes in a grouped category with the pocket kings, revealing a pattern of polarization issues, which is why that's becoming, or since I already know what the 30 hand pattern is, it was one of the concepts that I marked. So this player, when he goes back in, we've actually got this new program that helps you to create a mind map. Damn, I wish I could flash it. I'm going to show it at the CFP ones that I do at the end of the month when I outline the whole program. Basically, the mind map allows you to start with the root 3 things and then branch off like a tree almost in order for you to be able to distill your truth all the way to the core truth that you want to take from each concept. So it's a way to be able to like pin stuff up on the wall instead of having to remember it all in your head, and then a way to bring context around grouping hands together, just a way to organize your thoughts when there's a lot of micro stuff going on, so that you can eventually arrive at a really overarching, integrated theme, I guess, for the concept that you're trying to expand upon. Crazy ass, how do I know how much my equity will get to realize? You don't. And that's already the over analytical way of thinking about it. What you want to focus on is properties. And that's the practical way of looking at it. Like properties of your hand in terms of realization. Like, dude, you have a spade draw and you don't get called by much worse. In a lot of ways, that's way too simple. But that's the essential truth that comes from a lot of micro work and PO grid work that shows what happens in terms of counter strategies if he decides to check raise too frequently, or not even in terms of counter strategy, just how you get naturally exploited if he's going to defend a solid range when you bet a hand that weak. Here's a spot where I think it might be too assumptive to find the fold. Let's look at the line again. We're 3-betting the middle position player from the big blind. We're c-betting and getting raised. This already is a volatile line in terms of overall. What side are we on? Prima or something? I haven't found a site where the flop raise is not suspicious in this line. It comes from, in other words, the confidence interval that we develop for the alias consists of anything from too many bluffs to too many merged hands, in which case your hand at this type of like absolute value strength, just top pair, top kicker, becomes much more valuable. In other words, it'd be too assumptive of me to assign, and I know I'm still speaking on the flop, so like obviously the flop is a call. I know guys that would be like very worried on the flop, like, oh, I'm never dominating any hands in his range, and I also can't say he's bluffing, but that's a guy who's not coming from a context where he's done mass database analysis and sub-profiled the alias or created a confidence interval out of the alias to see what actually goes on here on average. So I want to go to the river so we can expand upon this, because this is where the assumption really creeps in. So now basically, in order to fold here, we have to be positive that we never dominate any value in his range, and that he's willing to reopen bluff here frequently enough, or that he's not bluffing here frequently enough to incentivize a check call. So, I mean, for the most part, I can't take it out of his range that he could be like value betting a weaker 2-pair at some rate. If he backed into like ace-8 suited, ace-4, ace-6, which is kind of a pattern that we see when guys merge raise flop just for protection or whatever, those hands I can't really take out of his range. They exist at a low frequency for sure, especially in this pre-flop formation. But I would say they exist at a non-zero frequency. What I really can't say with high confidence is that he has a flush here all that often and that he would never try to rep this flush. So here's where I'll go back to range versus range. Like, yes, we're folding very high up in our range if we make this fold. That's not the reason I'm going to make a call unless I think there's enough evidence to support that I think he could potentially be exploiting us. In other words, how strong is my confidence that this guy is never balanced with enough bluffs here? I'm not so sure I can say that. He's in a volatile pre-flop line, which plants him already in a profile because of this line, regardless of whether or not he's a reg, where he could potentially have more bullshit in his range. and now he's reopening on the river on a card that improved the quality of our hand, potentially has us dominating a small fraction of two pair, and could potentially be a card that he could perceive as good for his semi-bluffing flop range, depending on what level he's on. So could we say this card connects with flush draw? Yes, but like, can we say with high confidence that the pool raises flush draw in position at a really high rate? I don't think that's all that standard. So I'm getting to the point where not enough evidence is adding up that this guy walked into a flush on the river. Sure, he's got some combo draws from the flop. I mean, like backdoor, like wrap slash diamond draws, like king jack diamond and stuff like that. 5-7 diamond, like, might not even be in his range pre. He can't have the nut flush because the ace blocks it. So like, to me, it feels like it's assigning too much assumption due to the polarity, combinatoric polarity of his range on the river that he's repping, to say that from a volatile place on the flop where he had a bunch of possible shit because of the line he's in, because I know what tends to be showing up in that line, I can't find the confidence to fold because I would be making too big of an assumption. So again, see me go into the distillation of the counterintuitive, what am I not sure about? Through presenting, honestly, what I'm really not sure about, I land at a call because I'm not willing to make an exploitative fold based on an assumption that I'm not confident in. It's such a big shift in terms of the thought process, because as soon as you realize that what's left after you're honest about what you don't know is truth or well-balanced observation, you can trust your decision. All I'm saying here, in a non-biased way, I'm not even asserting anything. I'm just saying I really don't feel comfortable like making the assessment that this guy only has flushes and not enough bluffs here based on the information that he's presented from a flop that I have a high confidence data point in the line that he took, that it's volatile to begin with. That's quantifiable. That can get nailed up on the wall, but it requires you've done mass database hotspot research in order to put your confidence in it. So is there an aspect of database research that allows you to be way more accurate in this process of distilling to what you do not know? Yes, because there are certain quantifiable things that are reliable enough that we can say with high confidence that we should not question. Like the fact that in a vacuum, we need to be a little bit suspicious of what his flop raise means if we've investigated the general environmental alias approach in this line. That gets nailed up on the wall. That's not something I question again. So that's the reason when I go to the river, what I see in a very simplified format is volatile range on the flop, repping very polarized combinatoric value range on the river, where I also improve to a two-pair hand that has minor domination, potentially on weaker two-pair. And then I find the call because folding feels way more assumptive. Like folding is something I can't live with at the end of the night, because I literally put the guy on like 4 combinations of flush and never being able to bluff more than 2 combinations from the volatile shit that he could have been doing in a profile on the flop that's already more aggressive than most players. So I would call there. Same line. I marked this hand to pattern recognize in contrast. Here you have to fold the turn because it's a turn card that massively increased the equity distribution of a well randomized flop bluffing range for him. In other words, if he was bluffing equity driven from the flop, this card helped him a lot. And also from a hand versus range perspective, your hand is now shit. This is like one of the worst bluff catchers you have. So this one is a very clear fold in the turn. So when the student is now going back and looking at those 2 hands, he can create a pattern around the hand grouping that exposes different qualities that he can then parlay into an essential truth. Like maybe it's, okay, after calling the flop, I fold on very equity driven turns where my hand is decreased in strength. That's the essential truth for this one. And then the other one is, if the turn checks through, I have to be very careful how much credibility I assign to him reopening the river because of the volatility read from the flop. Now, I'm not even necessarily saying this guy has a lot of flushes here, because that would be contradicting what I said in the last one. But like the fact that he can be raising with like Diamond X hands and then peel this card that gives him way more equity-driven semi-buffs, that matters. And then he can also just peel top pair at some rate if he was raising some random king queens or king jacks. All that stuff is being taken into account. Three betting the flop would be better here if you had a really high confidence that he was merge raising and that he was ready to stack off, or if you had a high confidence that his bluff raises were very equity driven. Um, Tens is kind of a cool hand to do it with because it really desires protection if his range is weak enough on the raise to allow it to re-raise. But you have to be careful because at the point at which his flop raise is strong enough, you're overplaying tens under too high of a degree of assumption. So based on our assumptions that the pool is actually raising here a little bit too recklessly, re-raising with tens on this texture might actually be most incentivized. That's a good point. All right, I'm going to go through these fast. I have to be done by 2:30 today, but I want to point out these patterns and I want to give the correct play on each. I blew my timing today, but this hand is too assumptive of a check fold, I think. With the backdoor, I just think it boosts it. So we do check fold, we do check call the flop, but then we check fold the turn. I marked this hand because it should ring false to you that you're improving your equity with this hand and still folding. I'm not saying that's a core truth. I'm saying that generally that's a good indicator when you have overcards with flush draw and you can't check call the turn to a pretty normal bet size, like he's giving you 3-1, that it either means that his range was so strong on the flop that you should have folded, which is assumptive, or that you should call the turn. So you have to make the call. Like, you have to make the decision. Was his range so strong on the flop that if we check call, we can't even continue to check call when we improve our equity? That means the right play was check fold flop. Unless he's just some super turn nit where we can say the construction of his turn range is such that he's so narrow that now we can't even call with a king of heart and potentially live overcards. So just see how it's a little bit contradictory in terms of like, well, we're calling because we have backdoor equity, then we improve our equity, but we fold getting good pot odds because what? Now we have lightning sharp reads on what his turn bet frequency is. This is usually the fold that gets made because guys are afraid of facing a follow-up barrel on the river, but realize how that's not a good excuse. You have to call and deal with it because as long as this call is plus EV versus the range he's playing right now, there's a way to make it plus EV on the river or retain the equity of it, that retain the plus EV to the river as long as you don't misplay. The best way to do that would be to play perfectly optimal if you had no reads at all. Whether or not you can implement that's another story, but there's practical ways to go about dealing with different rivers that if you've studied hotspots and just general psychology or understand how textures interact with ranges and where people are more prone to bluff when their range is weaker, you can get around not knowing how to perfectly randomize this hand on the river by using practical bluff catching methods. This hand, if it doesn't improve, probably will never have a hard time on the river because it just has really poor components for a bluff catch. He could be doing anything from value betting thin to merge betting something stupid if he's being a wild fish that beats you with a hand he's like bluffing with. Plus you block. I wonder if you'd want to block the king of heart. I think it favors you to block the king of heart for sure. It removes some of his bluffs, but I think it removes a higher distribution of his value, so I take that back initially. But I just can't trust felting a non-pair hand in a spot unless I have a really high confidence that the villain is not bluffing with like what if he's just bluffing with like ace-3 diamond or pocket fives? Like I've seen it, and it makes me not want to even play around with bluff catching river with hands this weak. This is an ISO. It's a turn polarization issue. It's just a check back, so you see it again. It's a hand that, simply put, can't get called by enough worse and won't fold enough better, therefore it belongs in a check back range. Understanding the nature of production and how it happens when you polarize in poker is essential to sort of moving away from this malfunction. It's basically what it is, like a range malfunction. So those two main themes are pretty prevalent right now: polarization and forced aggression. This is polarization. If you looked at how much he actually improves in this turn relative to your hand, you'll see you have to be playing much more conservative when the turn. Start by checking. patterns. So all those polarization hands get grouped together and you create a theme out of them. And there's texture recognition too, where you're building your context of like, okay, I got to be more careful on these textures because I wasn't understanding the range versus range interaction as subtly as I need to. And sometimes it's just that. Sometimes it's not even like a core mental game misunderstanding of polarization. Sometimes it's just you not realizing how strong villain's range was in a certain spot. So it can be either. And it's up to the student to basically be honest about which it is. I'm not sure why this hand was marked. I don't think it was supposed to be, because I don't see really a problem. Oh, it's pre-flop. It's too loose. Fold it. Bottom of my range here versus, unless this guy's really wide, but even then I'm not really excited about playing these types of hands. The way I would exploit somebody who's wide is not to expand in this direction. I think I would just start by narrowing the pre-flop open. That's more I would call it my mature exploit, instead of this, which is more street, which I think is probably playable, but is more volatile and depends on more of his post-flop strategy before I think you can really guarantee that it's going to be profitable. That's an entire discussion in itself, though, that we don't have time for today. Polarization, forced aggression, and his third one was just assumptive ranging or bluff catching. Yeah, that one might be even bigger than forced aggression, where we saw him fold the ace-queen under the assumption that the guy just had the flush. Here's forced aggression. There is no profile that this makes sense to 3-bet against without with very little equity, because either he was the guy who wasn't check raising enough, who's already pushing too much equity to justify 3-bet bluffing with such a poor hand, or he's the volatile fish who's prone to just like do random shit like float you naked or min 4-bet you or 4-bet you merged or rip with a draw, or did I say float naked? Seen it. I'm not interested, basically, in this. Okay, bud, you can play that 5-3 suited. If that's the only difference in our perspectives that we have, I think we're going to be all right. This is a bluff catching thing. It's just too assumptive to think that this guy gets here with enough unpaired hands. Like, we could go in depth with the data in terms of textural reads, but like, let's just chalk it up to the fact that this line actually gets substantially underbluffed, especially on turn textures that don't provide much more additional draw. A lot of his backdoor draws and gutters will just bet the flop. The only real draw that came out on the turn is like 8-9, but he still has a lot of hands that he can be delay value betting in this line. So I think it's too assumptive, and it's something that's coming from a theory orientation that, well, I improved and I have to defend my checking range with a certain amount of hands. Here I'm focused more on his range composition, which I don't think polarizes very naturally at all. I see a ton of hands that can either auto value bet if he check back an ace on the flop, or if he wants to value bet a 10. And I just don't see enough hands that are able to float the turn unpaired that didn't already stab the flop. I think it's a fold. Why is the nuts? This is assumptive range reading to fold this turn. We're too high up in our range. There's just shit that he could have that we have to give resistance to. Again, it feels like the type of fold that gets made because we don't want to face a river barrel, but we just have to call and deal with it. In a future storm, or I think I might do a whole run at once lesson on the idea of volatility and multi-street bluff catching. I might save it for a run at once exclusive to talk about how you cannot fold a turn under the justification that you don't know what you're going to do when you face a river barrel. And it's the biggest thing that I see holding guys back from raising their call efficiency on turn spots, is like this really primal fear that they're going to compound an error to the river, when there's very simple ways to go about constructing a decision tree that prevents that from happening. So it's something, again, that a lot of my focus is on. So much so that I remember writing it down the other day, like, this needs to be a video in itself, because for a student to integrate this concept not only increases the call efficiency, but it ties together so many loose ends in terms of mental game leaks, and it will clean up so much of the energy. Like, you have to understand that the type of energy going on in you when you get into a spot like this and have to engage that paranoia and confusion and self-doubt about how you're going to play a river, that's toxic for your session. That's an energy that drives you into disempowerment and self-doubt, which manifests into distorted over-analytical thinking, which prevents you from seeing that you're actually being biased, which translates into assumptive decision making justified by irrational thought. A lot of times it never even goes challenged for its credibility unless you do a hand review with someone who's telling you like you have to look more at this, and then unless you're honest enough about it to actually evoke change. Did I not end up telling the story that I said I was going to tell? Because I want to tell it. I was closing the door and I said there's a story I'm going to tell, and it relates to this, where I just said you have to be available to change. I'm doing a review. It's going to be funny if I already told this and I completely forgot. But I'm doing a review of one of my CFP guys on the Storm, and I'm set up in the living room for whatever reason, and Tim is over on the couch, and sometimes a lot of times my computer's just streaming to my big screen because I'll just look at it through there. So he's watching the Storm and he's seeing me mark the hands. I go through the whole 5,000 batch, and I turn to him and I go, this guy might be the worst player I've ever coached. He's forcing aggression. He has no concept of polarization. He can't bluff catch for shit. And he's spewing pre-flop everywhere. And Tim starts laughing and he looks at me and he goes, but he's humble. And we both started cracking up because he understands. Somebody asked before, what are you looking for in a CFP student? And I think that's why I got into the story in the first place and just forgot to tell it. I'm looking for a level of humility that is completely available to the upgrades that I need to be able to penetrate. Like, I need to be able to penetrate your mind and have you trust enough that it's worth exploring something new for you to be able to let me reprogram you. Because if there's not that, I don't give a fuck if you're a 1 BB winner already at 200 NL. I don't want you because you don't scale as fast as somebody who I'm able to basically completely reconstruct. And this is why the more I optimize the training program, the more I can get it down to 10 hours of content, tailored content that really steps you up integrationally to a streamlined pattern that can put you 3 limits ahead if you just integrate what I'm telling you. That's what I'm interested in. And that's why I want the humble guy, because if I have the humble guy, it's all on me after that point. If I have a guy who will do exactly what the fuck I tell him to do and has ambition, it's a winning strategy for both of us. Because then it's all on me. Like, the buck stops with me. Either my program works or it doesn't. What fucks the program up is if my program works, but I have a student who either doesn't put the work in or is so frustrated with his own paradigm that he'd rather argue and hold on to notions that he's identified with too closely because of the implications of releasing certain belief systems, that it fucks up our progress. I do love to penetrate, server. You know best. 2 unpolarized, 10 hits his range too hard. There's also backdoor flush draws that came in. It's just a check on the river, and probably a check fold. Same thing here. A little bit better, but I think still 2 unpolarized. In a spot where I think the pool will probably overfold to you too. You don't want to be at the bottom end of a thin value betting range. You don't even chop. You don't even beat any ace-x here. Like, even if he has ace deuce, you're just chopping. So like, that's a big theme. Polarization might be your biggest theme here. Here's a spot where I thought there was an inconsistency in bluff catching. This might have been your strongest trait, looking at your hands. Like, I forgot to mention this, but looking at your hands, if you play like this on a regular basis, I'd be really surprised if you were not at least a 2 to 3 BB winner. Your folding to river spot, like, your river efficiency is very good for the most part, with the exception of you forcing aggression through, well, bluffing and being too depolarized. But facing aggression, your efficiency is very good. This was a this was like a slip up in that department where you're assigning too high of a confidence that you either have enough split equity or that he could be bluffing enough when there's flush and higher straight on board. A lot of this comes from being like, well, how much of that can he rep? But overall, it's just like, look at how strong, look at how strong your range is. You think he's really bluffing you here when the bottom of your value betting range is a 10 and you can have it at a really high rate? So either you have to say that he is bluffing you here at a frequency that would incentivize calling, or that you have enough split equity, and both of those are hard to say. Like, I really don't think many guys would raise a 10 here with all the other shit on board. Yeah, server's point is on point. It's the value betting thresholds that you need to work on. This hand I thought you could have found an above the rim fold under the data point that this is small blind versus UTG, and his range is going to be really hard pressed to have enough bluffs in it. That one's kind of subtle. I would need a fish read or some sort of volatile pre-flop read to be able to justify a river call there. Again, it's hand versus range instead of range versus range. That's clearly an optimal call in theory, but because there's imbalances that I can say with high confidence exist in that pre-flop formation on that texture, I can find the fold. This is another spot where versus the volatility, you need to be defending a hand that's well within an optimal range. Here's another spot where you're folding the turn on a too assumptive of a read. What was this line again? You're 3-betting, c-betting, check folding turn on a complete brick. He's just going to have enough unpaired stuff that floated flop that stabs here. You can't afford to be folding pairs in theory, and from a range perspective, I really think his range has enough air to incentivize you to call here. Again, we cannot fold because we're afraid of what will happen on the river. We have to call and deal with it. Polarization, multi-way. This is a really bad one. It's a turn check. Probably even just a flop check. This is forced aggression. You're turning a hand that's pretty high up into your range as a bluff. You're basically like requiring him to fold a substantial amount of king X now, and I think it's just a little bit too ambitious. So I marked it as forced aggression. In a way, you're probably requiring that hand to fold at some rate. It's a pretty good indicator if he calls that hand that your idea is wrong. Obviously results oriented, but obviously we get more of an indicator that our plan was bad when he calls us with fives than when he calls us with the nuts. Or straight. I'm going to save that hand for its own lesson. Basically, I've started checking back in those spots versus the more volatile profiles. I'm not saying we have a volatility profile in this guy, but equity realizations become more valuable to me here, and I tend to play a little bit more exploitative by playing a check back range with those hands. Bluff catching in a spot where after check call, check check bet, unless he's playing a very crafty, well-balanced check calling range, most guys are not capable of reopening enough here with bluffs. They'll just check down too much ace high. They really have to be going out of their way to be playing a lot of Broadway type floats or bluffing some ace X on the river to make this call incentivized. So again, it's a range versus range theory oriented bluff catch that needs to be balanced or overridden with exploitative hotspot data points that are high confidence enough to do the trick. ISO, call the raise, too assumptive of the fold, especially versus the volatile line to begin with. This guy's a limper pre-flop, so I already have a volatility profile for him. He doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. He could just have king jack here, like all day. If we're folding to the pot size bet, it's too assumptive to say that we know what the pot size bet means versus a volatility profile of a guy who already doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. Like, dude, you have problems with value betting thresholds. Think about his fucking problems with value betting thresholds. And now we're saying that, you know, he's got queen 10 or sevens here all day. Feel into the level of assumption of that, and then or separate from it, because it's not balanced enough to put your faith in. It's not balanced enough to invest in, basically. Forget faith. So that's a turn check call, and versus that profile, I'd be pretty much calling any river, unless he like massively overbet, in which case I might polarize him enough to say I don't dominate enough and I might find the fold. This hand I thought could have been a river bluff catch. There's a lot of stuff in his range that could have missed. I'm not so sure that he's under bluffing in a spot like this. We have good removal on top pair. Just trying to find you a little bit more like I wouldn't like mark this and be like, this is horrible, you're off the stake. But it's the type of spot where like if I'm looking for ways to increase your river call efficiency, I'm going to start in spots like this. I don't necessarily like this turn barrel versus the small blind. I'm very conservative with turn barrels in that spot, especially opening from the earlier positions. I think this range is pushing a ton of equity. It's much different from the big blind range. So just a data point. I wonder why this thing does that with, it says 57 of 30 now. I noticed this too. If you want to look at a part of your game, I don't have time to do it today, but like there's no way you should be 3-betting and not bluffing this hand. It gets bet at some point. So you're basically missing a bet. You might want it. I feel like I'm pitching my peel and knock course, but it's really not what I'm doing. Basically, if you're a type of guy who's trying to balance a checking range in the 3-bet line, but you're also butchering it, it doesn't make sense to justify that you want to argue for the checking range. You're better off picking a simplified, well-balanced strategy that allows you to put him to the decision, I guess, of whether or not he wants to defend enough, where I already know the pool has a hotspot of overfolding versus 1/3, so it funnels him into a line where the alias already plays poorly, as opposed to pinning you in a spot where it's proving you play poorly because you try to check down Queen 10. Okay, cool. I've got to run. I'm sorry I fucked up the timing of this. I went on too many rants, I guess. I really just wanted to get through the 30 so I could show the patterns. Let's check the schedule. I think I have descriptions. We're going to do one more storm, I think the 22nd with Stein, Sigmund Freud in the chat, I'm pretty sure. And then from there, we've got 2 CFP overview type lessons. One is going to be more of the outline of the course. 2 is the second one on the day of the launch, I think is when I'm doing it, is going to be more about what you can expect for the application process, which is going to be 1 month long, and you're going to have to do a total of 3 applications. There'll be a main application from March 1st to 12th, a callback from 12th to 19th where there'll be another assignment, just like 2-minute videos and stuff like that, but we'll give you specific things that we want you to talk about. And the cool part about this one is it's going to be based on your first video. Like we're really going to sit down and take your video seriously and be like, okay, here's what we want you to ask based on this. Here's what we want you to answer based on what you gave us already. So it'll be more personalized of an application process, which I feel cool about. Thank you guys for showing up. I hope you enjoyed the storm. I'm excited to get feedback and scale with it because the only reason I have this right now is because you guys show me what works and what doesn't. So grateful as usual. Got to run. See you the 22nd. Peace.